In this video, we're going to run through the process of taking an Illustrator document and getting it ready for use as an SVG to embed directly into our web page. So that's not importing it in using an image tag, but actually embedding it directly into the HTML, which gives us a number of things, number of advantages, such as being able to control the color through our CSS file, and also introduce animations of various kinds, and also certain forms of interactivity. So those are all really nice sort of benefits. So I've just quickly thrown this little illustration together, this sort of blobby figure or starfish-like thing. And what I want to do is to go through and just sort of make sure that this is all nicely prepared for use inside my actual web page. So one thing I want to do is to go through and patiently name all of my different parts of my illustration. Okay. And I do that over in the layers panel over here. You can see I've actually named the layer here. I've called this blob one frame one. Because in a subsequent video, one thing I'm going to be doing is doing some animation with this. All right. So if we open up that layer there, we can see all the individual paths, all the individual shapes, if you like. And I've named most of these already. So I've named things like the eyes here, for example, the pupil on this eye. You can see that's highlighted over here in the layers panel now. Blob one, eye, right, pupil. So it's very clear exactly what it is. It's the pupil of the right eye of this character that I'm calling blob one. All right. And similarly, I've got blob one, eye left pupil, eye left, and so on. And the mouth. What I haven't named yet is the basic sort of shape for the blob itself. Okay, which has this default name still, path. So what I want to do is just sort of double click on that till it's highlighted in blue like that. And I'm just going to call it blob one. This is an important step because it means that when I save this out as an SVG file for my project, that I'll be able to identify all of these objects. So each of them have their own ID attribute in the SVG code. All right. So if they simply had names like path one or circle or whatever, it would be difficult, especially with an illustration with any degree of complexity, very difficult to actually identify which bit was which. All right, so I'm just going to go to the file menu, choose save as. Okay, I'm going to save it into my project down here. I have actually already got it, but I've updated the file, so I'm going to save it in there again. It's just called shapemorph.svg. But the important thing here, of course, is under format to choose SVG as my format. And when I click on save, I'll have some different options. Yes, I want to replace the one that's already there. I want to make sure that the format is SVG 1.1. And everything else, all of the other default properties should be okay. All right, so I just want to click on the OK button down here. So it's saved into my web project. All right, let's have a look at the SVG code itself. Let's go over to Visual Studio Code. All right, so I've got my HTML here, and I've got my CSS here. Oops, I've got a previous version of that SVG. I'll just quickly pull that out. All right, a little bit of a sneak peek of what's coming up. Okay, so if I open up my images folder here, I've got a bunch of things in there, but this is actually the file I just made, shape-morph.svg. So if I simply click on that, that gives us a nice little preview of what it looks like, which is helpful in some situations. But what I really want to do is to see the SVG code itself. So I'm just going to right click on that and choose this option, Open With. Okay, and when that gives me a couple of options, and the one that I want is text editor. That looks a little better. All right, now I can see the actual SVG code. Let's have a quick look at what we've got here. Okay, so we've got a bunch of tags. They look a lot like HTML tags, though with some differences. We have the SVG tag itself. Okay, and everything from the opening SVG tag to the closing SVG tag down here is what we're going to be copying and pasting over here into our HTML. All right. In between, though, we've got a few other things. So let's break this apart. I might just sort of space this out a little bit to make it a little easier to read. Notice that Illustrator has put in this comment here. That's not particularly important, but the interesting thing to note is that it is in fact exactly like a standard HTML comment. So again, if you want to make your own comments in your code, which of course I encourage, you just hit Command / and you can write your comment. Okay, let's get rid of those for now. Don't particularly need those just in the minute. All right, so let's have a look at these tags in detail. So we've got defs element here, closes down here. Again, I'll space that out a little bit. So defs is short for definitions. So the standard thing that you expect to find inside a def section is the style element, which is exactly the same as the style element in HTML. And indeed, inside there is stuff that looks an awfully lot like CSS. In fact, it is CSS. So you see that Illustrator's made up this class name, ST0, ST0, ST1, ST2, and so on. But the key difference here is that rather than saying background or background color, the fill for these shapes is generated with the fill property. And here we've got a sort of standard hexadecimal color for white, FFF. Okay. So we'll come back to this in a minute, because what we're going to actually do is pull these CSS classes out, and we're going to rename them to names that are a little bit more human friendly and a bit more meaningful, and use those for our actual shapes. All right, so we come down here after the def section, see that we have a path here. Now this is rather sort of complex. There are a bunch of sort of coordinates here. We don't need to worry about that too much. What we do need to worry about is what this path actually represents. And here is an ID attribute, exactly like an ID attribute that you find in HTML. And we've got the name that we gave it over in Adobe Illustrator, blob1. So this is what I was talking about when I said you want to name your objects, your paths and so on in Illustrator before you import them, so that you can identify which shape is which. So again, I'm just going to space this out a little bit. Okay, we've got this sort of shape here. We've got the mouth, got the eye, got the pupil. Okay, all right, let's space these out. All right, so we've got the left eye and the right eye. Now, what I probably should have done over in Adobe Illustrator is I probably should have grouped these two together, the eye, meaning the whites of the eye, and its pupil. But I can, in fact, do that here directly in the code. So while I'm here, I might as well do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select these two circles, indent them a little bit, and I'm going to group them. Now, in Illustrator, of course, we group them by selecting them both and hitting Command G. Here I'm going to actually make a group. Okay, and I will give it an ID. I'll call it blob 1 I right. Okay, so that's an opening tag, which needs a closing tag down here. All right, so that's now grouped. So I'm going to save that. And I will do the same with these, with the left eye as well. I'm going to make a G for group, ID equals blob 1 I left. So that naming is consistent. The other things, let's just tab these in a little bit and give that a closing tag as well. All right. So I've just grouped these directly in code. You can, in fact, entirely handwrite SVG for things like these sort of cards with lots and lots of anchor points. That gets pretty complex. You probably wouldn't want to do that unless you're feeling particularly enthusiastic. Not sure I feel that enthusiastic today. But you can make little interventions in the code wherever you need to. You can add IDs, you can group things, you can change their coordinates even. All right, so if we, in fact, having saved that, because we've still got it open in Illustrator, if I go back to Illustrator, we should be able to actually see that these are in fact grouped here. Right. It's not, I might just open that up. Okay, that looks a little better. All right, if we have a look in the layers panel, you can see that these are in fact grouped here. All right, see that that's actually grouped that there. Good. All right, let's go back to our code. Let's take this SVG and put it into our HTML. Now, I don't need this XML direct declaration up here. Not so useful with what we're doing, but so what I want to do is just sort of click and select, copy, Command C, come into the HTML, and I've already got a section element here ready to go. I'm just going to paste that in with a Command V, and there we have it. All right, let's fix up that indentation because that's a bit ugly. So just going to select all this stuff here, get a Command right square bracket, and indent that in. Okay, good. That looks a bit tidier. Just sort of indent this stuff in a little bit more as well. Okay, good. So we've got fairly clear indentation now. We've got the opening SVG tag up here, closing SVG down there, and this stuff in between. Now, these class names, they leave a little bit to be desired, don't they? ST0, what does that mean? Well, it's got a white fill. Okay, so I know that that's actually the class that's being applied to the whites of the eyes. So let's do a search and replace. So if I just sort of copy that ST0, do a Command F to bring up the search, open that up. So I've got search, and then I'm going to replace that with a better name. So when I click on this button here, it'll replace all of the instances of ST0 with the class name that I choose. I think something like I is probably, or maybe I should even call it blob 1I. Who knows? I might make another blob shape further down the track, which has a different eye color. Okay. All right, so let's replace that. Okay, and you can see that there's my new class name there. And if we have a look at the eyes, there we have it there. All right, good. That looks pretty good. I'll just hit a command say S to save. All right, ST1. Which one is that? So I think that's actually the mouth. There we go. Class equals ST1. So let's replace that with the class called blob1 mouth. Okay, so it's done that there. That has the corrected class name, ST2. And what's that used on? That's used on the blob itself. So ST2 actually has that orange kind of fill here. So I'm going to just call that ST1 rather. Just replace that with a class called blob1. Sorry, ST2. Okay, so that's got that class name there. Good. All right, so these colors here we'll deal with later on. ST3, we've got one last class to replace here. ST3, that's the one I think that's just used for the pupils. Indeed it is. Let's call that one blob1 eye pupil. That's pretty clear what that class is for there. And again, Command S to save. Okay, so we get a bunch of class names here in our style element, and they're applied to the actual SVG shapes done here. That's all perfectly valid sort of code, but it's a really good idea to centralize your CSS in your CSS file. It makes maintenance a hell of a lot easier. And if you've got a whole lot of SVGs on the page, you may want them to share certain classes just for the sake of economy and maintenance. Perhaps you want to replace colors together. You might want to change the stroke width for a whole bunch of different shapes, things like this. So what I need to do is to sort of select all of those class names and cut them. So I'm going to, I tend to leave the defs section in there, but I will get rid of the style tag while I'm at it. So the reason I leave this here is because if I decide to put a linear gradient or something like that into some shapes, that actually does have to sit at least partially inside that defs section there. All right. So let's come over to our CSS file, styles.css. So what have I got here? I've got a bunch of color variables up here defined in my root selector. And I will actually use those colors in my SVG. And what I would normally do is I've got my various sections, typography, layout, decorations. Before animations, actually, I'll put another section in, which I will just call SVG, and I'll paste those class names in. Let's fix up an indentation with a left square bracket, command left square bracket. All right, good. All right, so let's replace these colors here from the Illustrator file with these variables. Okay, so I've got, for example, this absolutely pure white here. Let's replace that using the var keyword with one of my whites. So let's call that, put that white ice in there. Okay, the stroke color. All right, so it's a sort of a dark gray. So again, I'm going to replace that with, I've got a color I've called gray charcoal gray. I'll leave those other values as they are. The mouth, I think I'll use the same. I'll use the same white, actually, the ice white. The pupils, I'm going to fill with that same color I've used for the strokes. So again, using that bar reference. Okay, so that's got that color there. Let's replace this shape color for the blob one shape itself. Again, with one of my oranges. So I've got an orange medium here that I'll use instead. Now, of course, you could go the other way. You could define your colors in Illustrator, take them from here, and create further color variables up here. That would also be a pretty good way to work. But either way, you want to be getting that sort of consistency throughout. The advantage, of course, using a variable is that you can come up here, and if you want to have a look at that, it's looking a bit spooky. I've lost the pupils for some reason. I'll fix that in a minute. But it means that if I want to, say, change that orange color to something else, you can see that's changed over there. Actually, I don't like that color at all, so I'll revert that. Ah, that's what I've done wrong. I've given the pupil color a white instead of charcoal. That looks a little nicer. All right, there we go. All right, so there we go. So we've drawn an illustration in Adobe Illustrator, exported it out as an SVG, having named all of the different elements within it, opened up the code, customized the CSS styles, put them into HTML, and then moved those CSS styles themselves into CSS. And having moved them in, we've actually used color variables to get that consistency of coloration throughout.